know what people missed that part. All right, I'll do that again. I'm sorry. Good morning. We begin today's daf Ches Maseches Shevuos. We begin by thanking our sponsors. We thank the Tilson family for sponsoring all the shurim of the year as a zechus for B'suras Tovos for Am Yisrael. We also thank Shmuel and Robin Karabkin for sponsoring all the shurim of the month in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Shmuel's father, Leonard Karabkin, Lipa ben Yecheskel HaKayin. His yahrzeit is on Pesach Sheni, which is coming up this week. The family should have a nechama, and the neshama should have an aliyah l'gan eden. So, we are in the middle of a discussion over here. The Gemara taught us that there's carbon can be mechaper, the Sar and Nasa B'fnim can be mechaper for various different tumos. And the tumah that we're describing is where a person has the idea beforehand, he knows that he's not supposed to become tamei. Or I should say that differently, he knows that if he becomes tamei, he's not supposed to walk into the Beis HaMikdash or eat kachim. And at the end, after he does that, he has he becomes tamei, he walks into the Beis HaMikdash or he eats kachim, and then afterwards he realizes. So it has a idea in the beginning, he knows about it initially, he knows that if this happens, he's not supposed to walk in to the sanctuary, he's not supposed to eat karbanos, and then he has a lapse of memory in the middle, he eats the carbon or he walks into the Beis HaMikdash, then afterwards it hits him that, oh my gosh, I made a mistake, I shouldn't have done this, and that's when that's where he brings a carbon. That's where he brings a carbon olav v'yoreh. However, if he does not have the idea at the end, if he never finds out about it at the end, that's where this carbon is going to be tola. It's going to take care of him and kind of wait to be mechaper. It's going to take away all the yisurim until he actually brings the carbon. That was what we discussed yesterday. There was a havamin in the Gemara. We mentioned that there's other cases of tumah that perhaps this carbon should actually go ahead and serve as a kapara for it. There are other cases which are referred to in the Torah as tumah, even though they're not the classic case of ritual impurity, but they have a reference in the Torah as tumah. And we thought that perhaps this carbon also could be a kapara for that. What was that? It was Gilei Arayis, Shvichas Damim, and Avodah Zarah. So Gilei Arayis is immoral behaviors, Shvichas Damim, murdering, and Avodah Zarah, idol worship. So we thought that perhaps this carbon could actually serve as a kapara for that. So yesterday at the end of the Gemara went through these things and said, hold on a second. Just trying to figure out, we went through this very quickly, but if you go, it is 6 lines from the bottom, Amar Mar, quickly, just to run through it again, the Gemara says, so now in Zayin and Beis, about 6 lines from the bottom, Amar Mar, Yeshli b'inyan zeh lahavi gimel tumos. Tumas Avodah Zarah, Tumas Gilei Arayis, Tumas Shvichas Damim. The Gemara wants to figure out what these cases would be. Now, the obvious premise that the Gemara is going on is that if these cases are punishable in another way, then obviously there's no kapara. So if a person is going to be put to death, he's going to face the death penalty for one of these things. So then clearly this carbon is not coming to serve as an atonement for that. The other side of it is that if there is the ability to bring a carbon on its own for it, then this carbon is not necessary, or it doesn't work. The whole idea, we made it hekesh yesterday, of mipish'eyem to chatasam, is to be a pesha similar to a chet. Pesha is something which is done intentionally. A chet is something which is done unintentionally. And the idea was, just like something which is done intentionally, you can't bring a carbon. So this carbon is going to come to atone for another scenario where you can't bring a carbon. So what would that be? That would be a case where, as we described, you don't know about it at the end. But here, in this case, we're trying to figure out what would be the case of Gilei Arayis, Shvichas Damim, and Avodah Zarah, where there is no death penalty and there's no ability to bring a carbon. So quickly to run through it, the Gemara says, Shvichas Damim, Hay Avodah Zarah, 3 lines from the bottom, Hechidami, what's the case? The Gemara says, Ibn Mezid, if it's talking about where he intentionally went ahead and served Avodah Zarah, so he engaged in idol worship intentionally, knowing that it's forbidden to engage in idol worship. And he went ahead and did it. The Gemara says, hold on a second, Bar Katelu. So that's punishable by death. A person who intentionally goes ahead, serves Avodah Zarah, is punishable by death. So of course this carbon is not going to be a kapara for it. Ibishogi, if it happened by mistake, Bar Karbanu, let him bring a carbon. So again, the necessity of this carbon is just irrelevant. The Gemara says, no, what it's talking about is b'meiziv lo asri bey. talking about a case where he did it intentionally, but there is a loophole that he's not going to be chayav me, so he won't be put to death. Why? Because there was no warning. Or b'shogeg, another case would be he did it by mistake, delay. He didn't know. In other words, he didn't know before, and he didn't know afterwards. One of those things that came up, that would be a case where it would work. All right, now, the Gemara at the top of Chesam Amar Aleph, again, just to quickly run through this. Gilui Arayis, Nami Echidami. When it comes to the immoral behaviors, what's the case? Even Mezid, if he intentionally went ahead and engaged in this behavior, knowing that it was forbidden, the guy is subject to the death penalty. Ibishogeg, if it happened by mistake, bar carbon, little Maria carbon. So again, this carbon becomes irrelevant. Gemara says what it's talking about is the mazid, it was intentionally v'lo asri. But again, there's a loophole here. It was done intentionally, but he did not get a hasra. He did not get a warning, and since he did not get a warning, he cannot be punished with the death penalty. In other cases, b'shogeg, if it happened by mistake, v'lo siyadalei, and it was missing one of the necessary knowledges. Again, similarly, shvichas damim, the case where he murders somebody. Nami, what's the case? Hechidami, even mazid, if he intentionally went ahead and murdered somebody, bar katellahu, he's subject to the death penalty. He killed somebody. Ibishogeg, if it was an accidental death, bar galasu, he has to go to galas. So again, we don't find that there's just a carbon that is brought on his behalf, which serves as an atonement. He has to go to Aryeh Mikla. We learned about this. Gemara says it could be b'mezid v'lo asrubei. Same thing. He did it intentionally, but did not get a warning. Or b'shogeg, or if he did it by mistake, v'lo siyadalei, and he didn't know about it, he didn't have the necessary dios. Inami, another suggestion is b'hanach delabnei galostinu, a case where a person is not subject to galas. Like we mentioned, if there are a number of cases where it wouldn't be relevant, it doesn't go to galus. So there's that loophole. In other words, if he's going up with the axe instead of going down, in those cases, that would be where this carbon would potentially be relevant. However, it's not. That's what we said yesterday. However, even though we just found cases where potentially this carbon can be relevant to serve as an atonement, it doesn't. This whole idea was, what would the potential case be? And here the Gemara says the potential case would have to be where it was intentionally, but he didn't get a warning, or it was by mistake, and he didn't have the proper knowledge. Well, when it comes to a case of accidental murder, in those cases, it would have to be a case where he is just in one of those cases where he doesn't go to Galus. Okay, now the Gemara is going to go analyze this again. Amar. We were taught before. So again, this is on Daf Chesam and Aleph, and it is 2, 4, 6, 7 lines in. Amar. Really exactly the repetition of what we just said. You would think that this sire, this goat, is going to serve as an atonement for one of these three things. Talmud Lomar, the pasuk tells you, mi tumos, from the tumos, v'lo kol tumos. Now the Gemara goes on, as we said yesterday. Ma matzinu, what do we find? Shechila kakasov. The pasuk went ahead and divided and said there's a difference. Now, yesterday we mentioned that we don't know yet what the difference is. We find that there's something different about this tuma. So therefore, mechlal kol tumas, shechila kakasov, mechlal kol tumas. There is some type of difference when it comes to tumas mikdash ukadashav. Person walking into the base of mikdash when he is in a state of impurity, or eating karbanos when he's in a similar state of impurity. Now, in other words, the idea is we're proving that this carbon, this sire, this goat is here to serve as an atonement for a person who unintentionally walked into the base of Mikdash while he was impure, or a kachim while he was impure. Why? Because we find that particular tumah comes with a different set of laws than all other types of tumah. So therefore, that's the one that is going to serve as a kapara for, but nothing else. So now, you would have thought it serves as a kapara for Gilui Arayis Shvichas Damim Avodah Zarah. Now we learned that no, it doesn't. The pasuk says mitumos. It has to be that there's something special about this tumah, something different about this tumah, and once we find something different about it, we could say, all right, fine, that's the one that this sa'ir will be mechaper for. Divri Rabbi Yehuda, those are the words of Rabbi Yehuda. Now, the Gemara wants to know, my chilik, what is this difference? So where do we find that there's a difference about tumas mikdash ukadashav, that it has some type of leniency that I would say, okay, this is different than every other tumah, and therefore this carbon, this sa'ir, this goat, Hanasa b'fnim, which is done inside, is going to serve as an atonement. So again, just a quick reminder, we're going to read about this Mitzvah Hashem tomorrow. We read about this yesterday in Kriyas Torah. In Parshas Aryeh, we know that there are two different seirim, two different goats. One of them is referred to as the Sa'ir L'Hashem. Another one is referred to as the Sa'ir L'Azazel. The Sa'ir L'Hashem is the one that we're describing. It is nikrav. It is brought inside the Beis Hamikdash, all the way bifnim. That is the one that we're analyzing. The other one is the Sa'ir L'Azazel, is thrown off a cliff, and that has nothing to do with what we're discussing right now. Now, the Sa'ir Nas B'fnim, what's it for? What's its purpose? What does it come to accomplish? So we're saying what it comes to accomplish is that if a person knew at some point that there was a prohibition of eating kachim or walking to Beis Hamikdash when he's tummy, and he becomes tummy, and then he has a lapse of memory, he goes in, and then he forgets about it, he never has this subsequent idea about it, this carbon is going to serve as an atonement for that particular circumstance. Why? Because that particular circumstance has an exception. So says the Gemara, what's the exception? My chilik. What's different about this Tumah? So the Gemara says, Siman of Adazar, you let this Mitzvah. Nazar will go through all these cases. The Gemara says, it must be the Maisi Seira Velo Kifsa. Oh, sorry, I skipped. I skipped a line. My chilik, what's the chilik? The Maisi Ba'olav Yared. That this type of Tumah, he gets to bring a variable carbon. In other words, every other case where there's an Avera, there's a set carbon. This is what you got to do. You have to bring a carbon, you have to bring a chatas. It doesn't have a sliding scale depending on a person's finances. But this type of tumah, yes, it does have a sliding scale. So therefore, we find a leniency here already. Once we find a leniency, we might say, okay, this type of tumah has a leniency, and therefore this sa'ir can go ahead and be mechaper for it. The Gemara says, hold on, Eim Avodah Zarah. If you're looking for differences, let me look at all these cases. Eim Avodah Zarah, or my chilik. When Avodah Zarah, what would be the difference? Here's where the Gemara has this siman. D'maisi seira v'lo kivsa. So when it comes to Avodah Zarah, if a person wants to bring a carbon, he brings a sa'ir, a goat, v'lo kivsa, and not a sheep. So we find that there is a difference when it comes to Avodah Zarah. So perhaps, just like you found the difference when it came to Tumas Mikdash or Kadashav, you could also find a difference by Avodah Zarah, which is that it brings a sa'ir and not a sheep. Amar of Kahana, Anan chilik lahakal kamina. No, you missed something very important. We're not just looking for any difference. There are differences, of course. We need to find a difference which is more lenient. If you find a difference which is more lenient, that would serve as an indication that this should be the case where there should be an extra form of atonement. What's that? That would be that your carbon depends on your financial status. However, the fact that you have to bring a sa'ir and not a keves, a sheep, so anan chilek lahakal karmin and v'hai chelek lahachmiru. This is much more stringent. Why? Because what if there's a shortage of goats? The price is going to go up, and you have no choice. You have to pay for an expensive one. So it turns out that is actually a chilek lahachmir. That makes it more difficult, and therefore that's not what we're looking for. We're trying to find something which is more lenient. Again, if you're able to bring either a goat or a sheep, you go to the animal market and you find the cheapest one, and you can buy whichever one you want. But if you have a specification, you have to bring only a goat, and you have to pay whatever it costs to get a goat. Okay, so it must not be that this sa'ir hanasa b'fnim is going to work for Avodah Zarah. So Gemara says, Emi maybe it comes to serve for a yoledes. In other words, what does this mean? Let's say I have a woman who gives birth before Yom Kippur, and now she's supposed to bring a carbon. Part of her process of becoming tahar or tahora after she has a baby is she brings a carbon. Now, what if she had a baby right before Yom Kippur? She didn't get a chance to do it. So now the Kohen goes ahead and brings this sa'ir nas b'fnim. Perhaps that works, and she doesn't have to go bring a carbon afterwards. The Gemara says, what's the chilik of it? The Maisi olav yared, she also gets to bring an olav yared. Now it's important to note that she doesn't really bring the same type of olav yared, but there is an ability to bring birds over there. So therefore, the Gemara is calling it a carbon olav yared. Amar of Hoshia l'kol chatasam v'lo l'kol tumasam. Making a big mistake over here. We're talking about, in our cases, where someone does an avera, someone does something wrong. So this sa'ir, it says very clearly, it comes to serve as a kapara l'chol chatosa, If you look at the pasuk, it says Zechipar al Kodesh min tumas bnei Yisrael min pesheim l'kol chatosa, for an avera. This woman didn't do anything wrong. There's no avera that she did. She had a baby. So there's a tumah, there's an impurity that happens over there. She's bringing a carbon as a way of cleaning up from her tumah. Again, what that tumah is the whole discussion. Why she becomes tumah when she has a baby is the whole discussion. In Mitzvah Maseches Nida, we could address that. The bottom line is, what she's bringing a carbon for is not because she did an avera. She's bringing a carbon to get rid of all of her tumah. So therefore, it can't be relevant to her. This whole carbon is not relevant to her, and therefore it wouldn't work. Now the Gemara says, hold on a second. I understand that the woman didn't do it an avera by having a baby. However, you have to remember that Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, the Amar, Yoledes Nami Chotasi, that a woman who gives birth also does have some type of avera. Michael and Amar. So what's he talking about? What does the Gemara mean that she has an avera? So the Gemara tells us in Maseches Nida that what's the avera that she did when she's giving birth? It's so difficult and so painful and so overwhelming that she makes a neder right there, or Shevuos right then and there, that she's never going to be intimate with her husband again because she doesn't want to have any more children. It's just too painful and too difficult to deal with. And obviously in that moment, we can understand why she is saying that. But then again, women are much more mature than men. And afterwards, when it passes, they say, you know what, it was painful, it was difficult. But look, I have a baby over here. I love my child. And therefore she goes back on her Shevuos and she goes ahead and she gets back with her husband and she has more kids. So is this a big avera? A big avera. But ultimately, if you want to find some type of avera that her carbon is coming for, it's coming because she made this Shevuos at that time, saying she'll never have a baby ever again, or she'll never be with her husband ever again. So now this carbon is coming to atone for that sin that she had for making a false Shevuos. So okay. The bottom line is, if you can call it a chetz, and then perhaps this soyer, this goat, could actually serve as a kapara for her. So Michael Meimar, Gemara says, Reb Shimon l'taimei. You're forgetting that Reb Shimon is the same person who told us something else. What did he say? Amar mimikomo hu muchra. Yesterday we mentioned this. I'm going to get back to this again. Reb Shimon's of the opinion that you don't need to have this difference. Reb Shimon said, if you look at it, it says very clearly in the pasuk, mi tum os b'nei Yisrael. Mi tum os translates from the tum'os of Bnei Yisrael. That means some of them, yes, but not all of them. So he didn't have to make this drasha to actually find some type of difference or some type of leniency in the types of tumah. He just said it's only one that it works for. It only works for one, and therefore he says, what is that? This tumas mikdash kadashav, but not any other case that he could potentially describe as an avera or tumah. The Gemara says, okay, fine. Next one. Let's say perhaps that this Sara Anas B'fnim comes to atone for a Mitzora. Amar Rav Hoshi, again, the same thing. Who's a Mitzora? He's a leper. So what happens over there? L'chol Chatasa. It comes for an Avera. V'lo Tumasam. Again, Tzaras is a type of impurity. So what's this carbon coming for? We mentioned it's coming to atone for a sin, for an Avera. Something done wrong. This person had Tzaras. It's a Tumah. So therefore, we don't need this Sar for him. The Gemara says, hold on. According to Shmuel Bar Nachmeni to Amar, Al-Shiva Dvarim, Negayim Bayim, we learned that this Negayim actually do come from doing an Avera. And therefore, perhaps according to him, maybe the Sar is coming to atone for those things. What are some of those things? The Gemara in Erechim gives a whole list. The list includes Lashon Hara, Shvichas Damim, Shevuos Shav, so speaking, evil speech, gossip, murder. Again, certain types of murder where the person would have their atonement by themselves, have another atonement. Shevuos Shav. We'll get to this Mir Hashem in this Masechta later. Basically, a Shevuos in vanity, a Shevuos that makes no sense. Gili Aryeh, Gasas Haruach, haughtiness, different things, Gezel, Tzaras Ayin, stinginess. So Tzaras comes for all these kinds of things. So what do you mean that Tzaras is just a form of impurity and it's not a form of a punishment for an Avera? Of course it is. The Gemara says, Damar Shivit Dvar Negayim Bayim, Michael Meimar, the Gemara says, Hasam Nigia, I should say Nig'e the Achaperle, the Karbon Leshtari Bikal. You have to remember, yes, the Nega, the Tzaras, comes to atone for those averas. But when he's done with the tzaras, he got a kapara for the avera. In other words, the avera has already been wiped away. The carbon that he's bringing is not here for those averos. The tzaras he got is for those averos. Once he gets the tzaras and he goes through the process, now he's clean. Now he's good to go. No more avera left. What's the carbon for? The carbon would be to prevent him to come back into the kahal, which is ultimately to remove the tumah, and therefore it would not be relevant to this case, because this case would be talking about a pesha, some type of avera, not just for tumah. Okay, the nazir. Maybe nazir tameh. Maybe this would be for a nazir. A nazir is not allowed to become tameh, and maybe that's what it comes for. The Gemara says the chilik demaisi tayrum b'nei. He brings either doves, some types of turtle doves or birds. So he brings those things, which again, that's definitely a leniency. He brings that instead of bringing a carbon chatas, which is an animal, he gets to bring birds. So perhaps that's the difference that we find that will tell you that this sa'ir actually comes to serve as a kapara for that person. Amr Poshia, l'kol chatasam, l'kol tumasam. It said l'kol chatasam, l'lo l'kol tumasam, and therefore that comes to exclude the case of the nazir. If you see Rashi, l'chol tumasam, he says, "V'chimaisi nazir karban l'meicha aleh nazirus tyra maisi." He's coming for the tyra, but not for the chait. Rashi ultimately brings the pasuk gzeras akasafu loy chaylas nazirus ad maisi karban. So this is much more relevant for his nazirus and not for the chait of becoming tamei. Okay. Okay, fine. So you just told me that this carbon is coming for the tuma aspect, but not for the chait. Hold on, what happens for Blazer Akfar? The Amr Nazir Namichote. A Nazir has to be a carbon because he did an Avera. What's the Avera? So again, the Gemara tells us that Kadosh Baruch Hu gave us certain privileges and beautiful things to enjoy in this world, and he didn't ask us to make it Aser. So a Nazir goes ahead and turns himself to a Nazir, forbids himself from drinking wine, so to a certain extent, there's an Avera on his hands for forbidding himself to drink wine. So maybe indeed there is a chait, there is an avera by a nazir, and that would be the case that the sar is coming to atone for. Mar says he holds like Rav Shimon, who says no, you don't need that. You don't need this whole drasha to find a difference is not necessary, because he just darshans the fact that it's not going to serve as an atonement for this, because it says mi tumos, and that comes to say only one specific tumah, which is tumas mikdash ukdashav, and nothing else. Okay, now getting to this opinion. Shimon says you learn it out from its actual place. Aryeh Omer, v'chiper al kodesh mitumos. This is basically what I just explained, what I just spoke out. He explains, Aryeh Omer, the pasuk says, v'chiper al kodesh mitumos. It goes ahead and serves on the kodesh. It is a kapara in the Kodesh, inside the sanctuary, mitumos, to serve as an atonement for some of the tumos, which means, he explains, mitumos shal Kodesh. In other words, the idea is, it serves as a tumah from the Kodesh. So again, the way he explains this is that it says very clearly, the pasuk itself, if you read it and understand it, what is it saying? It's saying the chiper al kodesh, this soyer, this goat, hanas b'fnim, which is going to be brought inside. It is mechaper. It serves as an atonement. Mitum os, from its tumah. Which tumah is that? The Gemara explains. Mitumaso shal kodesh. In other words, we just got finished explaining that the first opinion understood that there's just some random single tumah that it atones for. And therefore you have a list. Is it tumas mikdash ukadashav? Is it going to be avodah zarah, shvichas damim, gili arayis? Is it going to be nazir and yoledes and mitzora? Any of these cases, very nice. That makes sense if you just have some type of difference. But if you read the pasuk and you understand what it says, the pasuk seems to say very clearly, mitum os, which means mitum aso, from its tumah. What is that? The tumah social kodesh, a person who violates the kodesh. How do you violate the kodesh? You violate the kodesh either by entering the sanctuary when you're tameh, or by consuming something which is sanctified or consecrated while you are tameh, and that is really what the pasuk means. The Gemara says, if that's the case, Shaper Ka'amar Reb Shimon. This sounds pretty good. In other words, just read the pasuk and understand it. So now, Rabbi Yehuda, who went ahead and made this whole drush over here, what was so difficult? Why couldn't you just read the pasuk like Reb Shimon? The Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda Amar Lach, Rabbi Yehuda will tell you, Ahumi Boile, he reads this very differently. He says, I need that for something else. Ki hechi da'avid lifnai v'lifnim, hachi navid behecha. Exactly as you do lifnai v'lifnim with the blood of this carbon, you do this in the heichal as well. What does this mean? So on Yom Kippur, a large part of the avoda is sprinkling the blood. So they'll take this soyer nas v'fnim. What they'll do is they'll shecht it, they slaughter it, they gather its blood, and then we have the achas lamala v'sheva lamata. We sing this in full glory on Yom Kippur. Achas v'achas, achas v'shtayim, achas v'shalosh, achas v'arba. It goes to the achas and the achas v'sheva. So there's a whole process of doing 1 up and 7 down. Maybe Gavik could do a rendition for us after davening, but after daf. But this is part of the procession. So now, what he says is the chiper al kodesh mitumos kodesh. The way he understands this is that kihechi de avid lifnai lifnim, exactly as you do inside the kodesh hakadashim to sprinkle the blood 1 up and 7 down. You do that again. We're bakodesh. Inside the sanctuary, which is in other words, you have the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKadashim. So bein abad, between the 2 rods on the Aron, that's where it's done first, inside the Kodesh HaKadashim. And the pasuk says v'chiper al HaKodesh mitumos, tells you do it again. Where? Bakodesh. Where is that? That's the parochus, the curtain that separates the sanctuary, the holy place, from the holy of holiest places. So you do it again. In other words, the way he understands it is not that it serves as an atonement for something that was done with Kodesh. Rather, he says, the process, the chiper that you're going to do, the process of doing this kapara is done by Kodesh. So he understands it very differently than Reb Shimon, therefore he has to make his drasha. Aryeh Omer v'chiper al kodesh metumaso kodesh shapakamar. I'm sorry, Behuda Omelach ahui baile. He needs that kihechi dav lefnai v'lefnim, exactly as you do achas tamal v'sheva lamata inside the kodesh hakadashim. Hachinavid behechi, do exactly the same thing in the heichal. You do it 1 up and 7 down on the parochas. Okay, so the Gemara says, all right. So now once we're getting into this, if that's the case, Reb Shimon, how does he know this? So how does Reb Shimon know that you can repeat the process of sprinkling the blood a second time on the parochas? The Gemara says, the pasuk says very clearly, if you read the pasuk, it says, and it says very clearly, such shall be done in the Ohel Moed. So says Reb Shimon, I don't need to understand the words in the beginning of the pasuk of the keeper al kodesh to tell you that you're going to sprinkle the blood 1 up and 7 down inside the Kodesh. You know why? Bless you, because it says v'chein yaseh, such shall be done. So therefore, I don't need to actually understand it that way. So the Gemara says, okay, Yehuda, pretty good point. Read the whole pasuk. The pasuk first tells v'chiper al kodesh mitumos. And why can't you understand that like Reb Shimon? And then you want to know how you're going to know to sprinkle it a second time on the parochas? Well, read the end of the pasuk. Reb Shimon, imi, if it only said that, havi amin, I would have thought nesi para v'sa'ir achrini. If it tells you v'chein yaseh, such shall be done inside the Ohel Moed, I may have thought what you're telling me is to bring a second set of karbanos. Now, that's a pretty big deal. So our pasuk tells us at the beginning that no. You don't bring 2 of them. This same sayer, anas b'fnim, you use its blood twice. Shimon, so according to Shimon, what does he do with that? He says, no, I'm sorry, that's just not what it means. The way I understand the word, v'chein yaseh doesn't mean to bring a second one. It just means repeat the process a second time. So ultimately what we have over here is, we have Reb Shimon, who is not really, he's not looking for some type of similarity or exception in Tumas Mikdash Ukadashav that would tell him that that one is special and that's the one that this carbon comes to atone for. Why? Because the way he understands it is it's pretty clear in the pasuk when it says mitumos. In other words, what it means is it's coming for a kapara for some type of tumah that happened by Kodesh. What is that? That's the case of a person who eats kachim while he's tamei, or a person who walks into the sanctuary when he is tamei. That's really just what the pasuk is talking about. No need for any drushes. However, Rabbi Yehuda doesn't understand it that way. Rabbi Yehuda, the way he understood it was is that the Chiper Bakodesh is just telling you to repeat the process of Achas Lamala and Shev Lamata, and therefore he had to actually find some type of identifying feature about Tumas Mikdash Kedashav that would make you choose that one that it's going to be an atonement for. The Gemara goes on. Amar Mar, Yachal al Kal Tumas Bakodesh Yehezar Zeh Mechaper. This is something we learned in yesterday's daf. Just bring it up again. You would have thought that this Sa'ir Hanas B'fnim comes as an atonement for all types of tumah. Talmud Lomar, what it teaches us is mi pishayim lekal chatasam. It serves for mi pishayim, for a pesha, for an intentional sin, and lekal chatasam for unintentional sins. Mind you, what is that? It's yesh ba yediyah betchila, the yesh ba yediyah basof. In other words, as follows. Yesterday's daf taught us very clearly that we learn from Peshem Kol Chatasam that just like a Pesha, when a person does something intentionally, he does not get the opportunity to bring a carbon. A carbon is an opportunity for a person to atone for an unintentional sin. Now, a Pesha is intentional. Carbon's not part of the process. A person can do tshuva, but a carbon is not one of those ways that a person can clean up an intentional sin. So we learn from that juxtaposition of those two words of mipishayim and kol chatasam that it has to be just like a pesha which does not get a carbon. So a chata, this chatas that it's coming to atone for is something where there's no carbon. So the sara nasa b'fnim can only come for an atonement for something that does not have the ability to bring a carbon. What does that come to exclude? This is ma'aniu yesh b'yediyah betchila. Person knows about it initially. The yesh b'yediyah basof. He knows about it after he had this lapse in memory. And that's the case which is going to be excluded. Where says, hold on a second. Hi bar carbon who? That's the case that you do bring a carbon. So what do you mean? I mean, we just got finished saying all these cases, we're trying to find a case where you can't bring a carbon. So what do you mean that this is a case that it's coming to atone for? Gemara says, lo tzricha no. In this word, it's yada le samach l'shkiya sacham. In other words, what we're talking about is a case where a person knows about samach l'shkiya sacham. So let's just talk out that case. It's Erev Yom Kippur. And a person, he's quickly running through his final last-minute tshuva preparations. He's thinking about himself. And he thinks, let me think about myself. This year I became tamei. And I, did this, did that, did something else. He's saying tefillah zaka. And he says, hold on, I became tamei. And while I was tamei, I walked into the Beis HaMikdash. While I was tamei, I ate a carbon. So now he finally has his last idea. He's like, hold on a second, I want to bring a carbon. But the Beis HaMikdash is a little busy right now, sir. It's Erev Yom Kippur. Lots of things are going on here. So he doesn't have enough time to bring a carbon. So then what happens? A full day of Yom Kippur goes into effect. They bring the Sar Lashem, which is an Anasa B'fnim. Perhaps that Sa'ir will exempt him. Maybe he'll be off the hook. Maybe after Yom Kippur, before building his sukkah, he does not have to go out and bring this carbon to atone for his Avera, because Yom Kippur was Mechaper. Gemara says, I would have thought that Adamaisi, then Nitli, Kamash Milan. I would have thought that he doesn't have to bring another carbon now, Kamash Milan, that no, it doesn't work. The carbon, the Sa'ir Nas B'fnim, only works for a case where a person does not have the idea basof. If you do not have the idea basof, then that Sa'ir Hanas B'fnim will take care of it for you. However, if you do have a Yediyah B'sof, if you find out about it at the end, you do have to bring your own carbon, and you're not going to be off the hook by the carbon that was brought as a carbon sipar. Gemara goes on. Amar minayin sheyesh b'Yediyah b'tchila v'ein ba Yediyah B'sof. How do I know that a case where a person knows about it initially, v'ein ba Yediyah B'sof, and he has this lapse of memory, and he never has that initial, that subsequent memory or that piece of knowledge that tells him that he violated the mikdash or that he was tamei, shesar zatola, that this sire is going to be a kapara for him. Gemara says, are you kidding me? Minayin, kashali. Didn't we just spend the entire Amud on that case? That's what we just said. We just told you that it's not going to work for a case where you have Yediyah in the beginning and Yediyah at the end. So now, what are you asking in this case? The Gemara says, this is what the Gemara's question was. Now that you told me that there's a comparison between a chait and a pesha, an intentional sin, and an unintentional sin, we say map sham lav bnei carbon, af chatam lav bnei carbon, and that's what we said in yesterday's Amud, that the comparison is, the way you're going to draw this parallel between an intentional sin and an unintentional sin, is that it, just like when it's done intentionally, there's no ability to bring a carbon. So the chait has to be a case where there's no carbon. Ema, I may say, map sham lav bnei carbon la'olam, I'm looking a little further into this, and I'll say, hold on. If a person doesn't have Avera b'mezid intentionally, there's never an ability to bring a carbon. He could do tshuva, he could do all kinds of things to fix that mistake. However, carbon is not on the table. Carbon is never going to be relevant for a person who doesn't have Avera intentionally. So I would have thought maybe I have to stretch that all the way over to say that would exclude a case where a person knows initially that he's not supposed to eat, kachim, or walk into the Beis HaMikdash when he's tamei. He walks in the middle by mistake, and then he never finds out about it afterwards. Now the problem over there is that's not a case where he could never bring a carbon. You know why? Because in 20 years from now, he finally has like epiphany. Like, hold on a second. I just realized in my timeline I violated my tumah. I ate kachim, or I walked into the Beis HaMikdash. So maybe that's not a case that could be atoned by this Sar Nas Bifnim, because it's not perfectly comparable to a case of an intentional sin. Intentional sin never gets to bring a carbon. This one potentially can bring a carbon as soon as he finds out about it. So maybe this carbon is not going to serve as an atonement for that. So what would be the case then? He does not know initially that there's a problem of eating kachim or walking into the Beis HaMikdash when he's tamei, v'yesh ba yediyah b'self. But afterwards, he did find out about it. So he was ignorant. He just never knew that while he's tamei, he can't walk into the Beis HaMikdash. He never knew that while he's tamei, he can't eat kachim. So what does he do? He shows up at a kachim party. His friend brought a shlamim. He invites him more toda. He sits down to eat it, and he's enjoying it. And afterwards, he's so inspired, and he joins the Daf Yomi share afterwards. He's like, oh man, I just found out that what I did yesterday was not okay. So, however, so in other words, the Gemara is suggesting that would be the case, and that would be the only case that would work. Now, you'll say, let's just slow down a little bit. Let's do this again. In my new, what would be the case? He doesn't know about it initially. The yesh b'yediyah b'sof, he finds out about it at the end. Aval, however, which case will I exclude? Yesh b'yediyah b'tchila. If he knows about it initially, v'ein b'yediyah b'sof, he does not know about it at the end. Kivan dechi misyadalei, since again, my new yesh ein ba yediyah b'tchila, yesh b'yediyah b'sof, avol yesh ba yediyah b'tchila, ve'ein ba yediyah b'sof, kiven dechi misyadali bar karbanhu. Since when he eventually finds out that he violated the tumah, it's a bar karban, ein malo litli, maybe perhaps it won't work. In other words, this is all an answer to that question. The Gemara asked, "My kakashali." In other words, we spent so much time, and we just got finished explaining that that's the case where the Sar Nas Bifnim is going to work, which is where he knew about it initially. He forgot, and then he never had a yediyah at the end. That's where the Sa'ir actually comes and gives him a kapara. Now the Gemara says, how do you know that? The Gemara says what the question is perhaps that's a case where it's not going to work because there's a potential for him to bring a carbon later on. However, when will this Sar Nas Bifnim serve as an atonement? That's in a case where you'll never have the potential to bring a carbon. What's that case? Where you did not know about it initially, so you violated it, and then afterwards you found out. So now you're thinking through it, can I bring a carbon? And you look through the Gemara and you say, no, I just learned, in order to bring a carbon I have to have a yediyah in the beginning, I have to have yediyah at the end, and a lapse of memory in the middle. So I have to have knowledge at the beginning, knowledge at the end, and sandwiched between those two knowledges, I have to have some type of lapse in memory. But if I never knew about it initially, so I'm never able to bring a carbon. Now, the Gemara is going to say, "V'chitema," lest you suggest ein b'yediyah b'tchila yesh b'yediyah b'sof sar nas b'chutz yom kippur mechaper. In other words, you're right. Maybe it would work, but it can't be that's what the Sar Nas B'fnim is coming for, because there's another carbon that actually takes care of that. What is that? That's Sar Nas B'chutz. That's the Sa'ir, another Sar that they did outside, and Yom Kippur itself. Yom Kippur itself actually serves as an atonement for that. The Gemara says, I may have said, Nepuch, Mepuch. In other words, I don't know which one does it. In other words, you're right. There's a Sar Nasa B'fnim and a Sar Nasa B'chutz. You have this go which is served inside and a go which is served outside. I don't know which one serves for which particular Avera. So Amar Kra, the pasuk says, L'chol chatasam, for all sins, Mechlal T'bnei chatos. And there has to be something which is potentially able to bring a carbon chatas, and therefore I'm not going to flip it around. So the Gemara says, okay, fine. So now everything lines up. The Sar Nas B'fnim is for a case where a person knew about it at the beginning, had a lapse of memory, and never found out about it afterwards. The Sar Nas B'chutz is for a person who did not know about it initially, and he violates the Tumah, and he finds out about it afterwards. That's the Sar Nas B'chutz, and Yom Kippur is going to be mechaper for that. In other words, just to explain how we know that, if you go to Rashi, the third skinny line in Rashi, l'chol chatasam, v'lo kisiv mipeshem umei chatasam, lomar, to say, achshav hu b'pesha she'eni bar karbon, v'yitla olav ad she'ov l'chal chatas. In other words, he has to be, right now, l'chlal chatas. In other words, that's learned from the word l'chol chatasam, since it does not say mipeshem umei chatasam, it says l'kol chatasam, and that obviously is referring to a case where there was a yediyah in the beginning. Okay, so now the Gemara says, "V'niskapar kapar gemura." Why does it have this, like, what this a quasi type of kapara? It's tola. The Mishnah says it hangs in there. Gemara says, "Iksiv mechatasam kidikav amrit." If it would say mechatasam, then you'd be right. It has to be someone who can come to a chatas. What's that? That's the person who knew about it initially. Now what's the only thing that's missing is they didn't know about it right now, but if they find out about it later, then they could come to a chatas. As Gemara says, hold on. So if it's not a full kapara, if it doesn't have a full kapara, so what is this thing that it's hanging in there for? Lomar, what it means to say is shemeis meis belavan. In other words, we mentioned this already yesterday because we got a sneak peek at this. But now the Gemara is asking, what does it mean that it's tola, that it hangs in there? In other words, it sounds like you're bringing a carbon, it serves as an atonement, but what type of atonement? So what is that? So the Gemara says, the first suggestion is that what if he dies before he has an opportunity to bring a carbon? In other words, he dies before he has this last piece of knowledge, he has to bring a carbon. So the Gemara says, perhaps this carbon will serve as a kapara for him. In other words, he dies clean. Amarava, that's not necessary. In mace, once he dies, misa marekes. What misa does is, death itself is an atonement. Death is a cleanser. So if a person dies, then it will serve as a cleanser for a case where a person could not have brought a carbon. In other words, typically a person has to do tshuva. There are some things that a person can't do tshuva for. Misa serves as a kapara for that, or Misa serves as a kapara for a case where a person can't do the tshuva. Why? Because he doesn't have the knowledge. So therefore, it's not necessary to bring this carbon for that. His death itself will clean that up. Ela Amarava, what does it do? Lahagin love mi yisurim. As we mentioned yesterday, it protects him from yisurim. Because when it comes to Averos, so there's the element of doing tshuva, which is a full tshuva gemura. But until a person does that, there's a potential a person might suffer up until then. So these components that are brought in the Beis Hamikdash served as a protection from those potential yisurim. Now the Gemara goes on to another case. The Mishnah tells us, that's what we just mentioned, which is that if a person does not know about it, he has no knowledge of the tumah beforehand, or the consequences of the tumah beforehand, then he violates it, then he finds out about it afterwards. So the sarnas b'chutz, the goat which is serviced outside, and Yom Kippur are mechaper for that. And the Gemara says, hold on, let's take a look at this. Iskish lahadadi. And the Mishnah actually goes through the hekish. Just quickly to remind us of what the Mishnah says. The Mishnah tells us He does not know about it initially. This is what we just read in the Gemara. For it says in the pasuk, "Milvad chatas hakipurim." Besides for the chatas hakipurim, al mash zeh mechaper. What this one is mechaper, it's the other one is mechaper as well. In other words, mapnimi, just like the inside one, ein mechaper el adav sheish b'yediyah, afchitzin in mechaper el adav sheish b'yediyah. Teaches us that it has to be some type of yediyah. In other words, the inside sa'ir serves for someone who has yediyah at the beginning, but no yediyah at the end. The outside one serves for a similar capacity, but where's the yediyah? The yediyah is at the end as opposed to in the beginning. So the Gemara says, since these two are juxtaposed to each other, what do you have to have two? Why can't you just have one? Once you have the hekesh, allow it to do both. Now what's the difference? Would this make a big difference if they, for some reason, did not have the opportunity to bring the sar outside? So the inside sar will serve as a kapara. Where it says no, you can't do that. Amar kra achas. The pasuk says achas kapara achas mechaper vein mechaper shtei kaparos. And the pasuk says the samach Aaron es shtei yad barosh asarachai v'svadalav es kol vanos bnei Yisrael v'es kol pesheim kol chatosam. No, that's the wrong pasuk. I'm sorry. V'chiper Aaron al karnotzav achas bashana midam achatas kakipurim achas bashana. It's important to note it says achas twice in the pasuk. That's what we're darshaning. The pasuk says v'chiper Aaron al karnotzav achas bashana once a year midam achatas kakipurim achas bashana. So the achas, the extra achas, tells you that it works for one, but not two. Gemara says, okay, fine. If that's the case, so then we'll do the other way around. Wasn't the sar and bachutz work for the case of inside, which is yediyah b'tchila, helam, and then no yediyah at the end? And what should have been done inside? The Gemara says, nafkamina will be the difference. L'tuma de'ira bein zeh lezeh. That would work if there was a tuma that happened in between. So in other words, there's a guy who's there on Yom Kippur, and he's tamei, and he walks in. They're like, sir, it's Yom Kippur, and we just brought the carbon, so now you missed it. In other words, we had this ability if you have the carbon earlier. Again, you can't say this to him because the whole idea is that he has no idea, but I'm just illustrating the case. Now the Gemara says, Amarkra achas bashana kapara zu lo tehei ella achas bashana. This kapara only happens once a year. Again, the additional word achas tells you it can only happen once a year. The Gemara really moves on a little further. Rabbi Shmuel da'amar ein b'yediyah b'tchila v'yesh b'yediyah b'sof bar karbon. So according to Bishmal, we had him earlier. He says you don't have to have a yediyah b'tchila, and he says even yediyah based rabbi, what you learned in school as a child, is not necessary. So according to him, Damar ain ba yediyah b'tchila, ba yediyah b'sof bar karbon hu. So sar and as b'chutz am I mechaper. Why is it that the sar and as b'chutz will work? Now, we said the external sa'ir, the goat that's serviced outside, serves for a kapara for a person who does not know about it initially. Then he violates it, and then eventually finds out. That's where the sar and as b'chutz works as an atonement. What do you need that for? According to Rabbi Shmuel, this guy could bring a carbon. So the Gemara says, mechaper. What's it to be mechaper for? According to him, it can't be that it works for that case. It must be a person who has absolutely no knowledge about it. Not before, not afterwards. So the Gemara says, no, that's not necessary because the Sirish Chadashim mechaper. That is already taken care of for Sirish Chadashim. It's taken care of by the goats that are brought on the Yom Tif and on Rosh Chodesh. Whereas the Solar Kameri holds like Kameri Amar, Kol Asirim Kapras and Shava, all the Seirim, their kapara is equal, all Tumas Mikdash Ukdashav, and it works for all Tumas Mikdash Ukdashav. So that's why you have to have this Sar Nas B'chutz, because all those Seirim are only serving for Tumas Mikdash Ukdashav. So Gemara says, Elamai Hachasa Iskish. So what were they actually brought there? My Hachasa Iskish Chitzon Lepnimi. Our Mishnah told us that the Chitzon and the Pnimi are Iskish one to the next. So for what purpose? He doesn't need that. He doesn't need that kapara. Like Gemara says, "Ein mechaper." Did I skip something? So the Gemara says, "Mapnimi," just like the inside one. Ein mechaper b'shar feros. The Pnimi is not mechaper for other averos. In other words, it's only for Tumas Mikdash Kedash. V'achitza and mechaper b'shar averos. It's only going to be mechaper for cases of Tumas Mikdash Kedash. In other words, we have various different cases of Mikdash Kedash. Yediyah b'tchila, Yediyah b'sof, no Yediyah b'tchila, no Yediyah b'sof, not in the beginning, not in the end. It all has to be within the realm of Tumas Mikdash Kedash. So that's what that Hekesh tells us. It has to be in the concept, in the parsha of Tumas Mikdash Kedash. If it's within that, it can be a kapara. If it's not, then it is not. Rabbosai, have a wonderful Shabbos.